welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Welcome to Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast. I am your host, Jessica, and we have the first official podcast of one of our brand new hosts who we are really excited to have here. And we're also really excited to welcome back this author. So first, welcome to our new host, Melissa.
Hello, everybody.
And Eliza, how many books have you published at this point?
I guess 6.
6. I believe we had you for at least 3 of those beforehand. We had you for
If I Disappear.
We had you for Good Rich People, which I literally talked to everybody about.
I cannot wait to read it.
And Girls and Their Horses. And now we are here for a book that is very different from your others, but no less thrilling. Please introduce yourself once again to the audience and tell us about It Had to Be You.
Hi, I'm Eliza Jane Brazier, and It Had to Be You. It is kind of like a romantic thriller. It's about these 2 assassins who meet by chance, kind of have some chemistry, and then they're separated. And 6 months later, they meet again, seemingly by chance, but it's actually not by chance because one of them was assigned to kill the other one. So it kind of like starts off from there, and it's just sort of this trans-European romp, very sort of fun, plotty vibes.
It was definitely, like I said, very, very different from your other books. And because of that, I just wanted to ask a little bit about your narrative for this one. You go back and forth between male and female narrative. Now, if I remember correctly, there was some male narrative in Girls and Their Horses, not as much, but this is really just very much a male protagonist, female protagonist, kind of playing cat and mouse against each other. Was it very different for you to sort of frame and plot it that way versus some of your past books?
Well, so what's interesting is that with this, I actually wrote a version of this book in 2010. And it was from the male character's perspective, the entire story. It's actually like an erotica. So it was in Europe, and it was this guy having a nervous breakdown and falling in love with somebody. And I really liked the voice because it was just such a clear, distinct, kind of funny to me voice. So I really actually took that character and the kind of setting and even some of the scenes, to be honest, and I transposed it. And then I added the female voice just so we'd get more of her character and she'd be as present as the male. And also to kind of balance it because I feel like she's a more light and kind of funny. So that was fun to be able to have both sides of the relationship that way.
Yeah, I actually really love your use of language throughout the book. Jess has this phrase that I'm now obsessed with, that it was spicy. It was a very spicy read, but I will say that it was spicy without being vulgar. I definitely blushed a couple of times throughout the book, but in the best possible way. I think that your language is just so beautiful. And there were so many times that I screenshotted it because I was reading it from my phone. If you don't mind, I'm just going to read a quick passage that I think was a really perfect example of this. Paris was made for the night. During the day, it is washed out, almost shy, embarrassed by its own gaudiness. But at night, it is confident, full of shadows and secrets, piss-soaked cobblestones, uneven footing, and spilled red wine. And someone, somewhere, is always playing the saddest song you've ever heard. I just put the book down. I went, oh my gosh, it was just incredible. So if you could talk a little bit about maybe your background, where do you find the language, and also why Europe? There were so many beautiful descriptions of Europe and the countryside, and it felt like there was such a personal attachment to it. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so like I said, so in 2010, I was living in London. I lived there for like a decade, so I'd probably been there 5 years at that point. So I was literally there, and I remember it was just this really hot summer, and as usual, I guess, in Paris, everyone was melting. But yeah, and I've been to all those places, and it was I don't remember a lot of my life when I look back at my past and my childhood or things but I remember my trips to Europe so well. Like the first time I ever went to Europe, I went to Florence and I took the overnight train to Paris, the same as what they have in the book, which doesn't exist anymore. And I did the whole Eurail thing where I was 6 weeks with the Eurail pass, just going on trains. I've been to every place that's in the book. And like those memories are some of the strongest memories that I have. So I really do. I love, and I really tried to bring this across. I love the romance of Europe. I love the humor. I love the way that you can just be transported by a train or by, whatever sort of ferry or bus, and you're in a whole different country, a whole different world with such different people and such a different look and feel. So yeah, I really wanted to bring that across because it's something that is really impactful to me just in my life, honestly.
I'm really glad you mentioned the trains because there were many train rides in this book. Now, did you choose trains because of your experience with it? I mean, also there's this movement throughout, which I think the trains and the fast moving cars really exemplify this. The chapters were very short and easy to get through. The dialogue was quick and witty. So I'm just curious if that was a conscious theme for you, that you wanted to keep this movement going, and if transportation had anything to do with that, and why trains specifically? Because I thought that was such a unique idea to have this overnight train. It was a scene you don't typically see.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, I am just really like, I'm very compelled by the romance of that. Like, I think it's just the best way to travel. And I think for the characters, I feel like both of them are kind of living in a fantasy world. And I feel like when I lived in Europe, it was almost like I was living in a fantasy world because everything's just so beautiful. You're so separated from your past and, your life before. And so I just kind of wanted to bring that kind of feeling across, like the romantic kind of vision of Europe. Like, when you see like those old, I really love European cinema, like old sort of like classic and like English cinema from the 60s and 70s, or even like American cinema that's like charade or something like that. Like I love that kind of old feel. And I love how the old world is such a huge part of Europe. And I feel like we kind of miss that in America with always building these new things and tearing everything down. And I just really wanted to write something that would really embrace that side of Western European culture.
So yeah, why killers? Why assassins? I think it's fair to say that both Jonathan and Eva were made for each other and made to kill each other. And of course, there's just something very compelling about that idea. But for you as a writer, why did you decide? Because your books have kind of been so different. You had the True Crime podcast one, If I Disappear. You had Good Rich People, which was very interesting. Girls and Their Horses were about this really very specific subculture. And then there's Assassins. How did you make it to Assassins?
I'm not like 100% sure, but I think because I write thrillers, I know somebody has to die. And I feel like it gets kind of heavy and tiring. So I wanted to do it in a way that felt lighter and kind of more fun. The way that I think of this story, I know it sounds crazy, and you're like, oh my God, the main characters are murderers. How am I going to relate to these people? I looked at it as being a fantasy novel. I didn't take it literally. You know what I mean? You know how like in a fantasy novel, like you have a dragon, you can have some guy who's like going to war and killing hundreds of people, and you can still kind of see them as, you don't see them as like being like a murderer necessarily, right? Because it's part of a bigger fantasy. I kind of saw it as just being a fantasy, but it's being played out in a world that's like quite similar to our world. And then for me, the whole killing thing is kind of symbolic. So like I wanted to talk about how trauma, like past traumas sometimes compel us. Like I feel like there's a stage in our life where sometimes traumas compel us to do things that are harmful to ourselves and other people. And that's in this book, in the context of this book, that's literally killing people, right? Which is a very extreme version of that. But it's about them kind of getting to this point where they're realizing what's actually driving that behavior. And they're like, I don't want to do this anymore. I want to change and I want to have a normal, like good life.
One thing that we both noticed was that Jonathan, for somebody who is a maniac and a killer, he's really quite sensitive, really quite vulnerable. I guess the fact that now that I know that originally this book was from only his point of view, did that change a lot now? Was he always just sort of very sensitive and
It was always the same.
yeah.
The original story, they weren't assassins. So he was like a business guy. He went to Europe. He was supposed to be doing this business deal, but it's somebody who's having not like a nervous breakdown, but kind of, right? So it's almost the same how it plays out in this story where you're like, this person's really taking things too far and it's a mess and is heading for like a break, like some kind of, so it's like that kind of thing happening. And then he just sort of meets this girl and latches on to her. And she has a much more like, she's backpacking through Europe and is a much kind of lighter person. And they sort of fall in love. So it was that. But the character's voice is exactly the same.
As I mentioned earlier, this book is spicy. There are touches of love throughout. There's definitely this match made in hell situation. Would you call this book a romance? What is the genre? There's mystery, there's thriller, there's so much going on. So what do you think this would be categorized as?
Good question. That's a question for my poor publisher. But when I originally pitched this book, I wanted it to be erotica. And that's kind of what I pitched it as, an erotica thriller, not an erotic thriller, because I feel like in an erotic thriller, sex is the bad guy. And I didn't want sex to be the bad guy. Like I wanted there to be a lot of sex scenes. And actually the original draft that I sent to my editor had 11 sex scenes. It was more than twice what there are now. And she was like, this is great and all, but it kind of slows down the pacing, which I knew it did, but like I just was determined, and so I did cut a ton of those, but that's kind of originally what I wanted. But because we did pull back on those, I feel like it's not erotica anymore, but I would definitely personally classify it as romance. Like I said, to me, the thriller elements, they operate more like symbolically. So to me, it's probably more of a romance than it is a thriller. Yeah. Because that's the whole heart of the story. You know what I mean? Like that's the major, like, everything really that happens too is in that context of it being a romance, I feel like.
So I want to know, because I ask you this question all the time and you always have the best recommendations. What do you recommend? What are you reading? Is there anything that you, one of my favorite authors, has to tell everyone that they should read?
There's 2 books that came out this week that I really liked. May Cobb's The Hollywood Assistant. And that was for me, like it's sometimes hard to switch off my writer brain and just enjoy something. And I feel like May, somehow she just pulls it off where I kind of start reading and like, and then within a few chapters, I'm so transported. I'm not thinking about the work in terms of, oh, what is she doing here? And what is what is this kind of trick that she's using or whatever it is, totally transported. And she uses all this setting and description and stuff like that. And usually I don't like that stuff, but I feel like with her, I do, like really helps me to just latch onto the story. And it was also still like really fast read. Then also this week, Rachel McGuire, who's actually my mom's neighbor. Well, it's a duo. So one of them is my mom's neighbor. And I always knew that she was a writer. And she came out with this book this week, and it's called On the Surface. And it's this really interesting kind of like layered mystery. It talks, about like, I love like YouTube bloggers and stuff. I actually really like watching them. So it has that kind of aspect of the story, and it has these cool locales, and, you don't sort of, it's very unique in the way that they presented this mystery. So that one's really good as well.
And what about you? Are you working on anything for the future?
Well, so I am this year, like I'm really trying to focus on my adaptation work. So I am adapting this as a movie right now. So I'm working on that and really trying to dig into that. And then I'm also developing like a couple of television shows. But so that's kind of where I'm at right now, because I have so many opportunities in that world that I wanted to try to force myself to not write a book this year. We'll see what happens, because sometimes I get ideas and then I'll start and I'll be like, Eliza, wait, just stop. Because like there's so much more I have to learn when it comes to script writing, and I want to make sure that I'm really giving that my all. But yeah, that's what I've been working on.
So the plot bunnies just kind of hop into your brain sometimes anyway.
It's hard because it's, a book is such a big commitment, but I know I can just let it simmer, because most of my ideas are things that I've been passionate about forever. So it's not like these kind of flash in the pan, like it's going to disappear if I don't write it. Hopefully it just gets better.
This was great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
So check out It Had to Be You by Eliza Jane Brazier. I loved it. Melissa loved it. You will love it. So once again, this was Jessica with Syosset Libraries Turn the Page podcast.
And Melissa.
And we are going to close this chapter.
Yippee!
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.